Nathaniel Brooks looked at the signature line for nearly a full minute before lowering the pen. The social worker across the table didn't rush him. "You understand," she said quietly, "that once this is finalized, you're responsible for her. Not for a week. Not until things get easier. For the rest of her childhood." Nathaniel nodded but didn't sign. Outside the office window, snow drifted across the parking lot. Through the glass, a small girl in an oversized green winter coat sat alone on a bench, carefully repairing the broken zipper on her backpack with a paper clip. Nobody had asked her to. Nobody was watching. She simply refused to leave it broken. That tiny act unsettled him more than anything he'd heard during the interviews. Because people who expected tomorrow usually didn't bother fixing today. People who expected to be left behind did. "Before we go any further, I'd love to know something about you. How old are you, where are you watching from, and have you ever been through a moment that changed your life because someone chose to believe in you?" Nathaniel finally picked up the pen. But before the ink touched the paper, he asked one last question. "If she comes home with me, what happens if one day she decides she doesn't want me anymore?" The social worker smiled with tired eyes. "That's usually the fear adults don't admit." Nathaniel sighed. 15 years earlier, his life had already been rebuilt once. His wife, Emily, had died after a sudden illness, leaving him with an empty house and a growing manufacturing company that demanded more hours than any human being should ever give. Friends told him to focus on work. Investors admired his discipline. Employees respected his fairness. What they didn't see was how silent his evenings had become. He wasn't looking for another family. He wasn't trying to rescue anyone. In fact, he had spent months saying no whenever people suggested adoption. He believed raising a child required more than good intentions. It required showing up every single day, even when work, grief, or exhaustion made it easier to disappear into something else. The only reason he had visited the county children's center that December afternoon was to deliver a shipment of donated heating equipment before another winter storm. Then he met Clara Whitmore. She never asked him for money. She never asked for food. She simply asked if someone could save a seat by the window on the ride back because she liked watching snow fall. "It makes everything look quieter," she'd said. That answer stayed with him. Over the next several weeks, Nathaniel returned again and again, not with expensive gifts but with conversations, puzzles, hot chocolate, and the kind of consistency children notice long before adults do. Still, Clara kept one habit. Every time she unpacked her small backpack, she folded her clothes neatly before going to sleep. Every single night. One evening Nathaniel finally asked why. Without looking up, she answered, "If I have to leave before breakfast, I don't want anyone waiting on me." The room became impossibly quiet. Nathaniel realized the greatest challenge wouldn't be convincing Clara that she belonged in his home. It would be convincing her that she no longer had to live as if every tomorrow might be her last there. Clara didn't unpack her backpack the first night. She slept with it resting against her chest, one hand wrapped around the worn strap as if someone might pull it away before sunrise. Nathaniel noticed. He noticed everything. He noticed that she counted every slice of bread before making a sandwich, always taking the smallest one. He noticed she apologized whenever she accidentally made noise. He noticed she asked permission before opening the refrigerator, before turning on a lamp, even before sitting on the living room couch. The habits weren't about manners. They were survival. Nathaniel had built a successful company by solving problems with schedules, budgets, and careful planning. Employees expected him to have answers. Investors trusted his judgment. Machines behaved predictably if they were maintained correctly. Children didn't. Especially children who had spent years believing adults always left eventually. One Saturday morning, he found Clara quietly washing the same cereal bowl 3 different times. "It was already clean," he said gently. "I know." "Then why wash it again?" She shrugged without looking up. "So nobody can say I didn't help." Nathaniel leaned against the kitchen counter. "Nobody's keeping score here." She gave him a confused look, almost as if the sentence didn't make sense. Someone always kept score. Didn't they? Over the next few months, Nathaniel learned that earning Clara's trust wasn't about grand gestures. It was about repetition. Every morning he drove her to school. Every afternoon he arrived exactly when he promised. Every Friday they ordered pizza from the same family-owned place downtown. Every Sunday evening they planned the coming week together, writing appointments and school projects on a large calendar hanging in the kitchen. Predictability slowly became stronger than fear. One rainy afternoon, Clara came home unusually quiet. She placed her backpack by the front door and disappeared upstairs without saying a word. Nathaniel waited. He had learned not to force conversations before they were ready. Nearly an hour later, she came downstairs holding a permission slip for a school field trip. "I told my teacher I couldn't go." "Why?" "The money." Nathaniel glanced at the form. The fee was $28. "You know that's not the reason." She stared at the floor. "If I don't go, nobody has to spend money on me." The words landed harder than he expected. Nathaniel walked to the kitchen table and motioned for her to sit. "When I was younger," he began, "my father owned a tiny workshop with 3 employees. One day I asked him why he bought expensive safety equipment when the old tools still worked." Clara listened quietly. "He told me something I've never forgotten. If you only spend money on things that make you richer, you'll end up poor in the ways that matter." He slid the permission slip back toward her. "You are not an expense, Clara." She blinked several times, trying not to cry. "You are my responsibility because I chose you." There was no dramatic embrace. No perfect movie moment. She simply picked up the form and whispered, "Okay." It was enough. As the years passed, Nathaniel kept sharing lessons that had very little to do with business and everything to do with character. If you break something, admit it before someone else finds it. If you make a promise, protect it like your name depends on it. Never ask another person to carry the weight of a mistake you made yourself. Sometimes Clara rolled her eyes like any teenager. Sometimes she argued. Sometimes she insisted the world didn't work that way anymore. Nathaniel never demanded agreement. He only asked one question. "When it's your turn to make the hard decision, what kind of person do you want standing in the mirror?" She didn't realize it then, but those conversations were quietly becoming the foundation of someone she hadn't yet grown into. Years later, when the hardest decision of her life stood waiting inside a courtroom, she wouldn't remember legal textbooks first. She would remember evenings around a worn wooden kitchen table where a father who never claimed to be perfect taught her that integrity wasn't something you talked about after winning. It was the reason you deserved to win in the first place. By the time Clara turned 18, the backpack she had once refused to let go was tucked away in the back of her closet. She never threw it out. Not because she needed it anymore, but because it reminded her of the girl who had once believed every home came with an expiration date. Nathaniel rarely talked about the adoption. He never used it as proof that he was a good man, and he certainly never expected gratitude. To him, being a father wasn't a story you told. It was a series of ordinary choices repeated so many times that they became invisible. Their house reflected that philosophy. Dinner was still eaten at the same oak table. Sunday planning sessions never disappeared. Birthdays were simple, usually ending with homemade cake instead of extravagant parties. Nathaniel could have given Clara almost anything money could buy, but he believed comfort without character created fragile people. Sometimes she complained. Sometimes she wished he would just say yes instead of asking another question that forced her to think. Looking back, those questions became the education she valued most. When college applications arrived, everyone assumed she would study business and eventually join Brooks Industrial. Even Nathaniel quietly imagined teaching her the company from the inside. Instead, Clara walked into his office carrying acceptance letters from several universities. "I want to study law." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. "Corporate law? Maybe. What made you decide?" She smiled faintly. "You." He laughed. "I've spent years teaching you manufacturing." "No," she said. You've spent years teaching me responsibility. She paused before continuing. You always say companies don't fail because people make mistakes. They fail because people stop telling the truth about those mistakes. Nathaniel looked at her for several seconds before nodding. If that's the lawyer you become, the world could use one. He never asked her to stay. He never offered her a position at Brooks Industrial to change her mind. Letting her leave was harder than he expected. The house felt strangely quiet after she moved into her dorm. He still cooked too much food. He still glanced upstairs when he heard the front door open. More than once he caught himself buying her favorite cinnamon coffee creamer before remembering she wasn't coming home until Thanksgiving. Meanwhile, Clara discovered that the legal world was nothing like the principles she'd grown up with. Brilliant students bent rules without hesitation. Interns competed by taking credit for other people's work. Professors praised clever arguments even when they ignored obvious ethical questions. For the first time, she wondered if Nathaniel's view of integrity belonged to another generation. During her second year, she accepted an internship at a respected legal firm specializing in corporate compliance. Her supervising attorney, Margaret Ellis, had a reputation for being relentless. On Clara's first day, Margaret handed her a thick case file. Read everything. Clara nodded. Margaret added one more sentence before walking away. Never confuse what's legal with what's right. Courts notice the first. History remembers the second. The words stopped Clara in her tracks. They sounded exactly like something Nathaniel would have said. Months turned into years. Clara earned a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions nobody else wanted to ask. She wasn't the smartest associate in every room. She wasn't the loudest. But clients quickly learned one thing. If Clara Whitmore told them something was a bad decision, it wasn't because she feared losing a case. It was because she feared what winning the wrong way would eventually cost. Nathaniel watched her career from a respectful distance. Their weekly phone calls continued, though they were shorter now. Sometimes they talked about work. Sometimes about baseball. Sometimes about nothing important at all. Neither of them noticed that life was quietly preparing a test neither education nor experience could fully prepare them to face. And when that test finally arrived, everything Nathaniel had spent 15 years teaching his daughter would collide with everything she had spent 7 years learning about the law. The phone rang just after 6 on a gray Tuesday morning. Nathaniel was halfway through making coffee when he saw the caller ID. It was the company's general counsel. People didn't call that early with good news. He answered without saying hello. We've received formal notice, the attorney said. The state has opened an investigation into the Ridgeway Bridge project. Nathaniel closed his eyes for a brief second. After all these years? They're reopening everything. The bridge had been completed almost 12 years earlier. It had become one of Brooks Industrial's proudest achievements, connecting two communities that had been separated by a river for generations. Then, 3 weeks earlier, inspectors discovered structural fatigue in several support components during a routine safety review. No one had been injured. Traffic had been rerouted immediately. But questions spread faster than facts. News stations replayed drone footage of the closed bridge every hour. Headlines suggested hidden negligence before investigators had reached a single conclusion. By noon, Brooks Industrial's stock had fallen nearly 18%. Employees whispered in hallways. Reporters gathered outside company headquarters. Nathaniel called an emergency leadership meeting. Around the conference table, executives argued over public statements, media strategy, and legal exposure. One vice president finally spoke the words everyone else had been avoiding. We should distance the company from the original approval process. Nathaniel looked directly at him. I signed the final authorization. That was 12 years ago. I still signed it. Silence settled across the room. Nathaniel knew exactly what admitting that meant. It also meant no one else would become the first target. Later that afternoon, he walked alone through the factory floor. The steady rhythm of machines had always brought him peace. Many of the employees working there had spent decades with the company. He knew their spouses' names, their children's graduations, who was caring for aging parents. To the outside world, Brooks Industrial was a corporation. To Nathaniel, it was thousands of families depending on promises he had made long ago. That evening, Clara called after seeing the breaking news. "Dad, why didn't you tell me? I didn't want your first call today to be about this." "It already is." She waited before asking the question only a lawyer would ask. "Did you know about any safety issue before the bridge opened?" Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. "I believed we had addressed every risk we understood at the time." It wasn't the answer she expected. It wasn't a denial either. After they hung up, Clara stared at her apartment window long into the night. For the first time in her career, the case that demanded her attention wasn't sitting inside a client file. It was carrying the name of the man who had taught her never to hide from the truth. Clara arrived in Pittsburgh before sunrise. She hadn't told Nathaniel she was coming. After 15 years of knowing him, she already understood what he would say. "Stay out of this." That was exactly why she couldn't. Brooks Industrial occupied nearly 4 city blocks, but the headquarters looked strangely subdued. Television vans lined the street. Reporters waited outside the entrance despite the cold drizzle that soaked the sidewalks. Employees kept their heads down as they hurried through the revolving doors. Rumors had become part of the morning routine. Nathaniel was already in the executive conference room when Clara walked in. He looked older than he had just a week earlier. Not weaker. Just tired. The kind of tired that settled behind a person's eyes after too many sleepless nights. "You should be at work," he said. "I took personal leave." "For me?" "For the truth." Nathaniel smiled faintly. "I suppose that's exactly what I taught you." Either of them laughed. Boxes filled with engineering reports, inspection records, handwritten meeting notes, and emails covered the conference table. Some documents were older than Clara herself had been when she first entered Nathaniel's life. She rolled up her sleeves. "Let's start at the beginning." For 3 straight days, they barely left the room. They reconstructed decisions made over a decade earlier. Every design revision. Every contractor meeting. Every inspection. Every signature. Most of the paperwork confirmed what Nathaniel had insisted from the start. The bridge had met legal standards when construction was completed. Independent inspectors had approved every major phase. Multiple agencies had signed off. Yet something kept bothering Clara. It wasn't what was inside the reports. It was what wasn't. Late on the 3rd evening she found a reference to an internal engineering review that appeared in meeting minutes but wasn't attached anywhere else. There should be another report. Nathaniel leaned over the table. "I don't remember one. But someone referenced it." She spent another hour searching archived digital files before finding a scanned document buried inside an old project directory. It wasn't labeled as important. Most people would have skipped it. Clara opened the file. The report described a concern raised by a senior engineer regarding long-term fatigue under unusually heavy traffic conditions. The projected risk was low. The engineer had recommended additional reinforcement before construction finished. Several pages later another memo explained why the recommendation had not been adopted. Not because it was ignored. Because independent consultants had concluded the probability of failure was extremely small and well within accepted industry standards. Nathaniel slowly sat down. "I remember now." "You do?" "We debated it for 2 days." He stared at the faded pages. "I asked whether delaying construction would create greater risks for emergency access across the river. The consultants believed the design was safe." "You trusted them." "I did." Either of them spoke for several moments. Finally Clara asked the question that mattered. "Did you ever read this report yourself?" Nathaniel answered immediately. "Yes." "And you signed the final approval anyway?" "Yes." The room fell silent again. Legally, the situation was far from simple. The report didn't prove negligence. It also didn't erase responsibility. Nathaniel hadn't hidden the concern. He hadn't ordered anyone to ignore safety. He had weighed expert opinions, accepted the recommendation of qualified consultants, and moved forward with a decision that thousands of leaders make every year. But leadership carried a burden that couldn't always be delegated. If the judgment proved wrong years later, the signature still belonged to him. Clara closed the file. If this document stays buried, nobody may ever find it. Nathaniel looked directly at her. I know. If it comes out later. I know. She felt an ache she had never experienced in any courtroom or negotiation. This wasn't about winning. It wasn't about losing. It was about discovering that the man she admired most wasn't flawless. He was something far more difficult to understand. He was human. Nathaniel reached for the old engineering report and gently placed his hand over it. When you were 12, he said quietly, you broke the dining room window playing baseball. Clara blinked, surprised by the memory. You came inside crying because you thought I'd be angry. I remember. What did I ask you? She answered without hesitation. You asked whether I was hurt. And after that? You said windows can be replaced. Character is harder. Nathaniel nodded. I meant every word. Clara looked back at the report resting between them. For the first time since the investigation began, she understood the impossible position she stood in. The document in front of her could protect the company's legal strategy if it remained buried in thousands of archived files. Or it could test every lesson Nathaniel had spent 15 years teaching her about honesty, responsibility, and the price of carrying your own decisions. Neither choice would leave them unchanged. The engineering report stayed on the conference table long after the sun went down. Either of them reached for it. It wasn't just another document anymore. It had become a question. Nathaniel finally broke the silence. The attorneys don't know this report exists. Clara looked up. You never told them? I remembered the discussion. I forgot the report had been archived separately. She searched his face, looking for any sign that he was trying to manipulate her. There wasn't one. He looked exhausted, but completely honest. The discovery process may never uncover it, he continued. The state requested the official project files. This copy wasn't stored with the final records. Clara slowly closed the folder. So right now, only we know. Nathaniel nodded. The sentence hung in the room with a weight neither of them had expected. Only we know. For years, Nathaniel had taught her that integrity wasn't tested when everyone was watching. It was tested when no one else would ever know. Now those words had returned, demanding an answer from both of them. That evening they drove back to Nathaniel's house together. The drive was unusually quiet. Snowflakes drifted across the windshield, soft enough that the wipers barely had to move. Everything outside seemed calm. Inside the truck, neither of them could find the right words. After dinner, Clara wandered into the kitchen. The old wall calendar was gone, replaced by a digital display, but the oak table remained exactly where it had always been. She ran her fingers across its worn edge. I used to do my homework right here. Nathaniel smiled. And complain about math every Tuesday. I still don't like math. You became a lawyer. You escaped numbers. For the first time in days, they both laughed. It lasted only a moment. Then reality settled back into the room. Clara placed both hands on the table. If that report stays hidden, your legal team has a stronger defense. Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. They'll argue we complied with every regulation. They wouldn't be lying. No. But they wouldn't know the whole story. Nathaniel looked at the empty coffee mug in front of him. I've asked myself that question every hour since you found it. Clara took a slow breath. What do you want me to do? The answer came so quickly it surprised both of them. I want you to forget you ever saw it. She stared at him. You've never asked me to ignore the truth. I'm asking as your father. And if I answer as the lawyer you helped raise? Nathaniel looked away. That's exactly what I'm afraid of. The room fell silent again. Clara walked to the living room, where family photographs covered one side of the fireplace. There was a picture from her high school graduation. Another from college. One from a camping trip where Nathaniel had accidentally burned breakfast and insisted charred pancakes were an American tradition. Every memory on that wall had been built on trust. Could she protect that trust by remaining silent? Or would silence quietly destroy the very foundation of it? Near the end of the hallway stood a small closet. Without thinking, Clara opened it. The old green backpack was still there. Nathaniel had kept it all these years. The zipper she had repaired with a paper clip as a frightened 10-year-old was still slightly crooked. She picked it up and smiled sadly. Back then she had believed survival meant always being ready to leave. Nathaniel had spent 15 years teaching her something different. That real courage meant staying. Staying in difficult conversations. Staying with painful truths. Staying loyal to principles even when they broke your own heart. She carried the backpack back into the kitchen and set it gently on the table between them. Nathaniel looked at it for a long moment before speaking. I thought keeping that might remind you how far you've come. It does. She rested one hand on the faded fabric. And maybe that's why I can't become the little girl who hides difficult things anymore. Nathaniel closed his eyes. In that instant he understood something he had never imagined. The values he had worked so hard to teach had grown beyond his control. And the daughter he had once promised to protect was now preparing to protect something even larger than either of them, the truth itself. Clara barely slept. She lay awake in her old bedroom, listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the furnace humming to life, tree branches brushing against the windows, the soft creak of wood settling in the cold. As a child, those sounds had convinced her she was finally safe. Now they reminded her that safety and comfort were not the same thing. Before sunrise, she walked downstairs to find Nathaniel already sitting at the kitchen table, a mug of black coffee untouched in front of him. Neither of them mentioned the engineering report. Not at first. Nathaniel slid a plate of toast toward her. You still skip breakfast when you're worried. She smiled faintly. And you still pretend burnt toast tastes better. It builds character. She laughed despite herself. It was probably the last ordinary moment they would share for a while. After breakfast, they drove separately to Brooks' industrial headquarters for another strategy meeting. Outside, camera crews had doubled since the previous day. Employees entered through side doors to avoid reporters shouting questions. Inside the executive boardroom, the company's outside legal team had already assembled. Senior partner Richard Lawson projected timelines and legal arguments onto a large screen. Our position is straightforward, he explained. The bridge met every applicable regulation. Multiple independent engineering firms approved the design. We defend the process, not public opinion. Heads around the table nodded. The strategy was legally sound. Richard continued. The state carries the burden of proving negligence. Based on everything we've reviewed, they don't have enough. Clara remained silent. She knew there was one document in existence that changed the moral landscape without necessarily changing the legal one. And no one else in the room knew it. Richard turned toward Nathaniel. I'll need written confirmation that all material project records have been produced. Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. The hesitation lasted only 2 seconds. But Clara noticed. So did Richard. Is there something else? The attorney asked. Nathaniel slowly folded his hands. There are archived materials we're still reviewing. Richard shrugged. Fine. If they're responsive, we'll produce them. The meeting moved on. But Clara understood what had just happened. Nathaniel hadn't lied. He also hadn't volunteered the truth. The drive back to her apartment that afternoon felt longer than usual. Her phone rang before she reached home. It was Margaret Ellis. I heard you're connected to the Brooks investigation. I am. Margaret's voice stayed calm. So let me ask you something without asking for confidential information. Clara waited. If someone spends 20 years building a reputation for honesty, and then faces one decision that tests everything they believe, what protects that reputation? Clara looked through her windshield at traffic crawling ahead. I don't know. Yes, you do. Margaret paused. The law protects rights. Character protects names. The call ended before Clara could respond. That evening, Nathaniel requested they meet one last time before formal hearings began. They chose a quiet diner halfway between his office and her apartment, a place they had visited for years after high school basketball games and college breaks. Nothing about it had changed. The waitress still remembered Nathaniel's coffee order. The booze still squeaked against the floor. For a while they talked about ordinary things. The weather. Baseball. A neighbor who had finally repaired his fence. Neither wanted to begin the conversation they both knew was waiting. Finally Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket and placed a small brass key on the table. Clara recognized it instantly. It belonged to the locked filing cabinet in his private office. "The original project journals are in there," he said quietly. "Everything?" "Everything I kept." She looked at the key but didn't touch it. "If I open that cabinet, you'll probably find answers either of us will enjoy. Why are you giving this to me?" Nathaniel leaned back and released a slow breath. "Because 15 years ago I made a decision to become your father." His eyes met hers with a mixture of pride and sadness. "I don't get to decide what kind of woman that made you become." Clara wrapped her fingers around the small brass key. It felt surprisingly heavy. Not because of the metal. Because by accepting it, she understood there would be no turning back. The next choice would belong entirely to her. And whatever happened in the courtroom, either of them would ever again have the comfort of believing that love could exist without the cost of truth. The courthouse was already surrounded by reporters before sunrise. Satellite trucks crowded the streets. Camera crews rehearsed their introductions. Protesters stood behind metal barricades, some carrying signs demanding accountability, others defending Brooks Industrial for the thousands of jobs it provided across western Pennsylvania. Inside, everything felt strangely quiet. The marble hallways echoed with footsteps instead of headlines. Nathaniel adjusted his navy suit without looking into the mirror. For the first time in his career, he wasn't walking into a board meeting where experience gave him confidence. He was walking into a courtroom where every decision he had made more than a decade ago would be measured one question at a time. Across the hallway, Clara stood outside a records room holding the brass key Nathaniel had given her the night before. She had unlocked the filing cabinet before dawn. Inside were dozens of handwritten journals Nathaniel had kept throughout the bridge project. Meeting notes. Personal reflections. Private concerns. Nothing suggested corruption. Nothing suggested greed. But one entry stopped her cold. Written the evening before final approval, Nathaniel had recorded his own doubts. The consultants remained confident. "I still wish we had another month for additional testing. Delaying the bridge means another winter of emergency vehicles using the old crossing. Waiting carries risks. Moving forward carries risks. Leadership means choosing when every option leaves someone exposed." He had never hidden uncertainty from himself. He had simply made the decision he believed would protect the greatest number of people. That journal changed nothing legally. But it changed everything morally. When the hearing began, state investigators outlined the bridge's structural deficiencies and questioned whether Brooks Industrial had exercised sufficient long-term caution. Nathaniel answered every question directly. He never blamed engineers. He never blamed consultants. He never shifted responsibility onto employees. Whenever the court asked who approved the final recommendation, his answer remained the same. "I did." By early afternoon, the state's attorney requested confirmation that all project-related materials had been disclosed. Richard Lawson stood. "To the best of our knowledge, they have." For a brief second, Clara closed her eyes. She understood exactly what that sentence meant. Richard believed it. Nathaniel knew otherwise. The courtroom waited. Slowly, Clara rose from the gallery. Every head turned. Richard looked confused. Nathaniel didn't move. "Your Honor," Clara said calmly, "with the court's permission, I request that additional documents be entered into the record." Richard whispered sharply, "Clara, what are you doing?" She didn't answer him. The judge nodded. "Approach." Clara walked forward carrying the journals and the archived engineering report. Her hands were steady. Her heartbeat wasn't. She explained where the documents had been located and how they related to internal discussions during the original project review. No dramatic accusations. No emotional speech. Just facts. The courtroom remained silent as copies were distributed. Richard buried his face in his hands. Nathaniel watched his daughter without interruption. The state attorney quickly reviewed the engineering report before looking toward the witness stand. Mr. Brooks, were you aware of this recommendation before final approval? Nathaniel inhaled slowly. Yes. And you approved construction anyway? Yes. Why? The room seemed to hold its breath. Nathaniel looked toward the courtroom windows before answering. Because leadership sometimes requires choosing between imperfect options. He paused. I believe the independent experts who advised the design met every accepted safety standard. I also believed delaying the bridge would place surrounding communities at immediate risk for another winter. I made the decision I thought would protect the most people. He lowered his eyes briefly. I accept that history has the advantage of knowing what I couldn't. The judge studied him for several moments. So you're accepting responsibility? Nathaniel nodded. For my decision. Not for someone else's. Not for something he didn't do. For his own judgment. After reviewing the newly disclosed material, the court concluded there was no evidence of fraud, concealment, or intentional misconduct. However, it also found that executive leadership had underestimated foreseeable long-term structural risks and required Brooks Industrial to undertake extensive corrective measures under independent oversight. Financial penalties followed. So did mandatory safety reforms across future infrastructure projects. Outside the courthouse, reporters rushed to frame the outcome as either victory or defeat. Inside, Nathaniel saw neither. He turned toward Clara as spectators slowly left the courtroom. For several long seconds neither of them spoke. Finally, Nathaniel smiled. Not because they had avoided the worst outcome. Because the young woman standing before him had done the one thing he had spent 15 years teaching, and one thing he himself had almost been too afraid to ask of her. She had chosen the truth even when it came at the highest personal cost. In that moment, Nathaniel realized something no verdict could ever measure. The greatest thing he had built was never the company whose name appeared on the courtroom documents. It was the character of the daughter who had just carried his own principles farther than he had been able to carry them himself. 3 days after the hearing, the television trucks were gone. The sidewalks outside Brooks Industrial were quiet again. Employees still talked about the case, but the conversations had changed. Instead of wondering whether the company would survive, they were discussing the long list of engineering reviews, safety audits, and operational changes already underway. Nathaniel insisted on attending every meeting. Not because anyone required him to. Because he believed responsibility didn't end when the judge left the bench. One afternoon, he stood before several hundred employees inside the largest assembly building. There were no teleprompters. No carefully crafted public relations speech. He simply stepped to the microphone and spoke the way he always had. I made a decision years ago that I believed was right, he said. Some parts of that decision proved wise. Others deserved greater caution. We can't change the past. What we can change is the standard we hold ourselves to from this day forward. The room remained silent. Then one employee began applauding. Another joined. Soon the entire building echoed with applause, not because Nathaniel had claimed to be perfect, but because he had refused to hide behind anyone else. After the meeting, several long-time workers approached him. One machinist who had been with the company for nearly 30 years shook his hand. My dad always told me a real leader owns the hard days first. Thank you for proving he was right. Nathaniel smiled. I wish I'd learned that lesson sooner. Across town, Clara returned to her legal practice. The courtroom had changed her in ways she hadn't expected. Colleagues congratulated her courage, while others quietly questioned why she had introduced evidence that complicated the defense of someone she loved. She answered every version of the question the same way. My father didn't raise me to protect his reputation by hiding the truth. He raised me to honor it by living the truth. Weeks later, Nathaniel called and asked if she could meet him on Saturday morning. He didn't say where. When Clara arrived, she found him standing beside the old county children's center where they had first met 15 years earlier. The building had been renovated, but the wooden bench outside remained exactly where it had always been. Snow had begun falling again, almost the same way it had that winter afternoon long ago. Nathaniel sat down on the bench and looked toward the parking lot. I've been thinking about this place a lot. Clara sat beside him. So have I. For a while they watched children playing near the entrance, laughing as they chased one another through the snow. Nathaniel finally broke the silence. You know, I used to think the biggest decision I ever made happened the day I signed those adoption papers. Clara turned toward him. And now? He smiled. I think the biggest decision happened the day you stood up in that courtroom. She frowned gently. I thought you'd say that was the hardest day of your life. It was. He nodded. But those aren't always different things. Clara felt tears gathering in her eyes. I was terrified you would hate me. Nathaniel gave a quiet laugh. I was terrified you'd choose me over your principles. She looked at him, surprised. I almost did. I know. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. It was the old paper clip that had once held together the broken zipper on her green backpack. I found it years ago after you finally replaced the zipper, he said. You kept this? I kept it because it reminded me of the bravest little girl I'd ever met. Clara carefully held the bent piece of metal between her fingers. It reminds me of someone else. Who? The man who taught me that broken things aren't fixed by pretending they were never damaged. Nathaniel's eyes filled with tears. Without another word, Clara leaned over and hugged him. Not because she had saved his company. Not because the case was over. But because, for the first time, they both understood what had truly survived. It wasn't a business. It wasn't a verdict. It was the trust between a father and his daughter, a trust strong enough to endure the weight of the truth. As the snow continued to fall around them, either hurried to leave. Some journeys don't end with applause or headlines. Some end exactly where they began, with one person choosing another, and both becoming better because of that choice.